Salam, shalom, peace. I'm Azra Hussain, President of the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, also referred to as ISBA or ISBA. Welcome to this month's Ilm Circle. Today, our presenter is Paul Rockauer. He's the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Phoenix. He's formerly the Executive Director of Levantine Public Diplomacy, an independent public diplomacy organization. He has managed the U.S. Department of State's American Music Abroad and Next Level programs in dozens of countries around the world, including many countries in conflict. He's partnered with numerous U.S. diplomatic posts to run public diplomacy programs in countries like Algeria, Iraq, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. Today's topic is public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and gastrodiplomacy. I don't know about you, but this sounds very interesting to me. Please engage our speaker by typing your answers in the comments section below. And I thank you all for joining us. Thank you, and here's now Paul Rockauer. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Azra. Assalamu alaikum, shalom, mistach al khair, ismi Bulus. أنا أتكلم شوية عربية. أنا أتكلم أنا درست في المغرب. أنا درست دراسة الشرق الأوسط والدين الإسلام في جامعة، وأنا سكنت في المغرب ل15 أشهر. أنا عملت في الشرق الأوسط في العراق، في الجزائر، في تونسية، برنامج كتير. And I'm not going to speak my whole program in Arabic, but that's my way of showing my appreciation. I am a friend. I studied Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at Brandeis University with a focus on Jewish communities in the world of Islam. I studied in Morocco after 9/11, and I lived with a Moroccan family, and it completely changed my perspective on the world. And so this is my way of showing my cultural appreciation. I've worked all throughout the Muslim world. I've worked in everywhere from Morocco to Bangladesh to Pakistan, and I'm going to share a bit about my work in public diplomacy and what that entails and cultural diplomacy. But I've spent a lifetime trying to build spaces in which different cultures can connect through the intangibles. So for the last 7 years, I had been working with the State Department, running the State Department's flagship music diplomacy programs in places all over. I mean, in the Muslim world, in Bosnia and Senegal, in Bangladesh. I'll share a little bit about that. For 7 years, I didn't have a fixed address. I was running cultural diplomacy programs from place to place. I didn't live anywhere longer than 2 months. The longest I lived anywhere was in Morocco. And I've traveled from Beijing to Cairo, from LA to Panama by bus. I've been a bit of a nomad, or truly Ibn Battuta, and I'm honored to have visited Ibn Battuta's grave in Tangiers in Morocco. So I'm going to share a lot about public diplomacy and what that entails. Joe, if you could put on the slide, please, so I can get everyone on the same page and talk about some of the concepts that we're going to be working. Great. Joe, I'll have you move to the first slide so that we can dive right in, because we got a lot to cover here and a lot of information to go through. So the very first question is, what is public diplomacy? Because public diplomacy is the antithesis of diplomacy. Diplomacy is very high level, it's very secretive, it's government to government. Public diplomacy is the communication of policy, culture, values from government to foreign publics or from communities. And it's how we communicate who we are. It's how countries or communities communicate their policies, their culture, their values. It's the intersection of communication and either foreign policy or domestic policy. Public diplomacy understands that you don't reach people through rational information, but rather through emotional transrational connections that come through things like music and food and art and dance and culture. And in terms of advocacy, in storytelling and sharing who you are, sharing your history, sharing the story that makes you what ticks. There are 5 pillars which come through public diplomacy. The first one on there is listening. You have to listen to your audience. You have to understand the language of your audience. You have to understand what are the issues that your audience is dealing with. And from that listening is how you can somehow reach the advocacy, the storytelling. The most basic part of public diplomacy in terms of the practitioner work, in terms of the things that I've been engaged in, is cultural exchange. That's things like study abroad, things like the Fulbright program, the Rotary Foundation. It's taking someone out of their comfort zone at home and putting them in a different situation so that you can learn through experience. I worked on a program called Seeds of Peace, which brings together Israelis, Palestinians, Egyptians, Jordanians, Indian, and Pakistani teenagers, brings them together for a summer in Maine, in the state of Maine. And literally you have, this sense of distrust. You have people who have never been in the same space together. The first night, Israelis can't sleep because there's Palestinians in their bunk. Palestinians can't sleep because there's Israelis in their bunk. Indians, Pakistanis, vice versa. And you get them living together, working together, playing together, having dialogue, breaking down those barriers. That's what cultural exchange is all about. What I'm going to dive into today is cultural diplomacy, how countries communicate their heritage, their music, their food, their culture. This is kind of the crux of public diplomacy. It helps share who you are. There's another aspect of public diplomacy called international broadcasting. That would be things like the Voice of America, the BBC, France 24, Deutsche Welle, Al Jazeera is a good example. These are government-sponsored international broadcasters that communicate outside of the market. These are things that are sponsored by the government. We're not going to get so much into the international broadcasting, but we'll talk a little bit about this in the communal side of things. I'm also going to touch on something called communal public diplomacy at the end of this. Now, your public diplomacy contributes to what is called your soft power, the power of your influence, the power of your resources, the power of your institutions and models. It's really about the attractiveness of your culture and your values. And you see countries trying to promote their soft power, and you see communities that use their soft power, use the power of your example, the power of your institutions to help strengthen civil society as a way of strengthening who you are. Now, I have a master's in public diplomacy from the University of Southern California, and there's a scholar there by the name of Manuel Castells, Professor Manuel Castells, and what he says of public diplomacy is the definition that I most ascribe to. He says, public diplomacy is the projection in the international arena of the values and ideas of the public. The aim of the practice of public diplomacy is not to convince, but to communicate, not to declare, but to listen. Public diplomacy seeks to build a sphere in which diverse voices can be heard in spite of their various origins, distinct values, and often contradictory interests. It's about making a space in which different cultures can connect. And my role in public diplomacy for many years was to be the equivalent of a public diplomacy Sherpa. I would manage these programs. I would construct this space in which these different cultures could connect through these intangibles such as music, food, art, dance, and culture. So I'm going to go to the next slide, please, Joe. And the next slide on top of that, please. So I started working with, no, one back, please. Perfect, thank you. So I started working with the State Department for a small nonprofit called American Voices. American Voices runs performing arts academies in countries in conflict. They have run performing arts academies in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sudan, all sorts of places. And I ran a performing arts academy in Iraq, teaching jazz, breakdance, symphony, theater, teaching orchestra, and we taught all sorts of theatrical works. We did Hamlet in Kurdish and Arabic, Minham Yanim, to be or not to be. That's a very profound question when you're running a performing arts academy in Iraq. But one of my favorite parts of this program was we had a musical composition program, which taught theories of music composition and how to apply them to traditional Kurdish and Arabic music. And then the students would write their own pieces. And when I talk about the students, these were people who were part of the youth orchestra of Kurdistan, the Iraq youth orchestra. These were people who were going to be the next generation of cultural leadership. And the Yes Academy, this was the academy that I ran in Iraq, was aimed at helping strengthen their skills, helping strengthen their pedagogy so that they could be the leaders in the cultural sectors within Iraq. And so, as I was mentioning, we had this musical composition program, which taught theories of music composition and how to apply it to Kurdish and Arabic music. I'm going to play for you a little example. One of the best pieces we had all sorts of wonderful pieces that were written called the Baghdad Waltz. This one I'm going to play as a Kurdish piece, and these were performed at the end at the final concert by the youth symphonies, by the Kurdish and Iraqi youth orchestras, which were part of this academy. So Joe, if you could play that first video, please. This is called Khalifu Shikhani. So that was a scene from the Yes Academy Iraq. That was a new music composition written by a music student. That's part of the work that American Voices would do, running performing arts academies all over the world, doing symphony, orchestra, jazz, breakdance, symphony. Another part of the work that I did with American Voices was American Voices ran the State Department's flagship music diplomacy program, American Music Abroad. American Music Abroad is the evolution of the Jazz Ambassadors program. You see a picture up there of Louis Armstrong, Satchmo, who's one of the original jazz ambassadors, which the State Department sent around the jazz ambassadors, artists like Louis Armstrong, Dave Brubeck, who else? All sorts of jazz greats that they toured all over during the Cold War. And one of the things that helped win the Cold War was jazz music. Jazz was super popular all over the world, and they sent these jazz artists to be jazz ambassadors. Well, the program evolved into American Music Abroad, which was open to all different types of music, blues and bluegrass and Hawaiian, hip hop, rock and roll. So the program takes trios, quartets, and quintets and takes them on 4 to 6 week tours through usually 4 to 6 countries. So I took the group that's pictured there. It's a group named Della May. It's a 5-girl bluegrass band. And I took them to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and they were also in Pakistan. And I also took another group named Keola Beamer and Moanalani Beamer and Jeff Peterson. It's a Hawaiian slacky guitar group who did the music for the movie The Descendants. I took them to Brazil, teaching Hawaiian slacky guitar and hula music, and mixing that with different styles of music. So American Music Abroad would send these groups on these tours where they would do concerts, workshops, master classes, collaborations. They would learn local music from wherever they were touring, and they would do these tours to be cultural ambassadors. They would share parts of American culture that you might not get. You're not going to get bluegrass in Central Asia. It's just not, this takes music that's not part of the market. You might get pop music in faraway places, but you're not going to get these intangibles like Hawaiian music or bluegrass. So I took Della May, this 5-girl bluegrass band who was eventually nominated for a Grammy. I took them to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, sharing bluegrass culture, sharing American bluegrass, and they learned songs as well through their cultural exchange. So Joe, I'm going to ask you to do the next video. This is Della May doing Lab Peati Hai, which is a poem by Iqbal, for which they learned while in Pakistan. So Joe. So that was Della May performing Lab Peati Hai by Iqbal. So after my work with American Voices, I went on to found my own organization called Levantine Public Diplomacy, where I worked with alumni from the State Department programs to help continue their cultural diplomacy work. I worked with the 5-girl bluegrass band Della May. I took them to the World Cup in Brazil while touring in the South. And meanwhile, I sent a rock and blues band called the Clinton Curtis Band, who had also been on the American Music Abroad program. I sent them to the North. They're doing rock and roots and reggae, and they were connecting with Brazilian music in the North, kind of the Afro-Brazilian music scene. I took groups like the Hawaiian slacky guitar group. I took them to Zimbabwe. We did an Aloha Zimbabwe program, connecting the spirit of Ubuntu with the spirit of Aloha. And I took that same Hawaiian slacky guitar group to Venezuela. And this is how you build bridges, is by connecting people to people and by connecting through culture. These intangibles where you don't have to speak the same language, but you can feel the energy, you can feel the connection that comes through this. So during my work with the State Department for the 7 years I mentioned, that became about a third of my work, was taking these alumni groups from the State Department's flagship music diplomacy program and continuing to connect them with different embassies around the world to run cultural diplomacy programs. And then the next slide, please. And then I also ran the State Department's hip hop diplomacy program with the University of North Carolina's music department. And hip hop diplomacy is the true evolution of jazz diplomacy. What jazz diplomacy was and how it was so universal, hip hop is today. Hip hop is modern poetry. It's a form of street journalism. It's a way of communicating through verbal and nonverbal communications. And what I would tell you that the difference between the hip hop diplomacy and the other work with the bluegrass and the blues and the Hawaiian music is that the bluegrass and blues and Hawaiian, that was cultural diplomacy. That was showing a different side of American culture that audiences abroad might not know. You know, in Uzbekistan, they didn't know bluegrass. They liked it once they heard it, but they didn't know it. Whereas the hip hop program, that was cultural exchange. I would take teams, actually, next slide, please. I would take teams of MCs, DJs, next slide, please. DJs, next slide. Beat makers or music producers, next slide, please. And break dancers. So I would take teams of MCs, DJs, beat makers, and break dancers to connect with local hip hop communities all over the world, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Bosnia, in Bangladesh, in you name it, all through Central and South America. Some years I worked in Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Uganda, in Tanzania. But there we would find local hip hop communities, and we would work with them to build a platform for them to get their work out further. We would put on these workshops, these week-long workshops, maybe week-long, where we would look at how to use hip hop as a form of social activism, using hip hop for entrepreneurship, for conflict resolution, depending on where we were working. But this was this epistemic dialogue of hip hop artists from the US and hip hop artists in Tanzania, El Salvador, what have you. And while they might not speak the same language, they spoke the same language that was hip hop, because often hip hop communities are dealing with the same issues, the same feelings of dispossession, the same feelings that society is not listening to you. And hip hop is a way in which people can express themselves. For example, I worked in gangland El Salvador, one of the most difficult, most gang-ridden areas of El Salvador during one of the worst issues of gang violence in El Salvador. I mean, literally the epicenter of gang violence. And working with hip hop artists, and if you ask them to talk about the issues they face in their community and society, these are tough dudes. They're not going to speak about it. But if you put a microphone in front of them, you give them a beat, they can express themselves in ways that you wouldn't be able to do it, in talking, in writing. But through that poetry that is hip hop, you were able to really get this out further. So we would put on these hip hop academies, the next level academies in San Salvador, in Dhaka, where we would work with MCs, DJs, beat makers, and breakdancers to work on these issues of social activism. And then we would put on a concert at the end to help them get their work out further. And when I talk about hip hop artists, I was working with hip hop artist educators, people who used hip hop test prep, hip hop pedagogy, hip hop, as a form of reading, helping to improve literacy. So these concerts we would put on would help get these hip hop communities, give them a platform to get their work out further. Next slide, please. Did I freeze? So another part of the program is we would do collaborations with traditional music wherever we worked. So in Bangladesh, I was mixing hip hop with Baul music, with Bengali folk music, and mixing Kathak dance with with break dance. In Zanzibar, I was mixing Tarab music with hip hop. All sorts of Poro and Fandango of Colombia, taking these traditional forms of music. And because hip hop is so fluid and comes from so many different genres and is so malleable, we would mix these forms of music together. And this was done for two reasons. One, to show the local artist that you don't have to do what you see on YouTube or on TV. You can take what is in front of you, your local culture, and you can build on that and create something new. So I'm going to have Joe play that the next video, the 11A. This is a little example of the hip hop collaboration from Uganda.
Yo, sub, this is
No,
Black Sang and
Sean. Sorry, I forgot to play this one. We'll leave this first and then I'll move the next one.
US Embassy. Hey, okay. Listen up, come on. 1, 2, 3. I'm busy. Shaka shaka su butta ipore shobai dekhe bage office ada lotte Dhaka city maje kala kore pola ase keu jane na bhaya সম্পদ কে আমরি তেমন কিছু না খুব বেশি পার্থক্য নাই আমার মা কে ও ঘুমায় কালা টাকা বেড়ে আমার ঘুম ভাঙে আমার নিচে স্বপ্নের রাজ্যে Now I'm busy now me not come busy mal material abar VIP এমন ভাবে ছড়াই দিছি এই চাবি loser wanna be Zarapi I'm a swag flow style flow যতই করছ না কেন কপি হইতে পারবো না বিজি এটা করাটা এতটা ইজি তাও লিরিক্যালি ক্রিমিনাল জিনাল অরিজিনাল অটোমেটিক লজিক্যালি জন্ম নিছি অর্ডিনারি তাও জীবন অটোমেটিক ভারী তাও জীবন মন বাদি রিকশার ঘর নিজের লাগে জুয়ারি that's what's up sign out Black Zambi Boxer Sean that's what's up fear
Sorry, that was not the collaboration. Let's go back a slide. That was actually Black Zang, who is an artist in Bangladesh. I'm sorry, I meant to play that earlier. He's an MC we worked with. And one of the things you find, which is interesting, the biggest influence in hip hop culture in Bangladesh, and Dhaka is putting it down as the hip hop capital of South Asia. The biggest influence was a group here from the 90s called Bone Thugs and Harmony, because Bangla is such a bouncy poetic language and their style of hip hop was this very chopped up bouncy flow. And so you had all of these rappers in Dhaka who sounded like they were this 90s hip hop group, Bone Thugs and Harmony. So that was not the collaboration. I'm going to have Joe play the next video. This is a collaboration from Uganda. That was just an example of some hip hop worldwide. And this is a collaboration video. So go ahead and play that one, Joe.
Shawty probably gives a clean catch up with your body when it's school, but not at home. So much unknown. Journey to your center and just search. Travel traverse in and out of universe. Some days it hurts. Some days it hurts. You try to play it out too soft. Something in one of those blocks sitting on it never stops. Funny how time takes out flies. It's open ended as a lover's eyes. She got an old soul with regrets. You're taking baby steps. Still so perplexed. A heart gets broken and it's open. 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 You were not alone, said flesh alone. The soul stopped by on its way to sky. Then the shawty probably gives a plan. Catch up with your body when it's school, but not at home. So much unknown. Journey to your center and just search. Travel traverse the in and out of universe. Some days it hurts to try to play it off too soft. Soaking in what others like. The steady yearning never stops. Funny how time takes out flies. As open ended as a
So that was an example of the collaboration type work that we would do in the field. And that was the Hip Hop Diplomacy Next Level, which I worked on for many years. The program still exists. It's, right now, given COVID, it's not running. But that's the form of cultural diplomacy that I found the most profound was hip hop diplomacy. We're going to move on to the next slide, please. Talk a little bit about my favorite topic, which is called gastrodiplomacy. Gastrodiplomacy is how countries or communities communicate their culture through their food. As you can see on that slide there, my favorite quote is by Frederick Kaufman: "The history of the world is a history of hungry people." I am one of the founders of the field of gastrodiplomacy. I was one of the first to start writing about it and talking about it when I was a master's student at USC. It is a field that I've been very involved in and very engaged in. It is, to me, the greatest form of cultural diplomacy is done through your connection to food. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So within the field of gastrodiplomacy, there are three concepts we work with. The first one is called culinary diplomacy. This is how you use food in the diplomatic process. So what do you serve when the King of Morocco comes for a state dinner? What do you serve to help facilitate negotiations? So for example, during the Iran nuclear talks, there was a lot of focus on how they were able to break down some of the barriers by eating together. We're getting the diplomats to break bread together as a way to build trust. I'm not going to talk about culinary diplomacy that much because that's something that's more high level. Again, I'm kind of focusing on what's called public diplomacy. The issue of public diplomacy with food is called gastrodiplomacy. As I mentioned, how countries or communities communicate their culture through their food. Food is our most universal value. Actually, it was James Beard who said, and I'll give that in a second. The last part of gastrodiplomacy is what's called social gastronomy. That's how you address social issues using food as a medium to focus on these issues. I'm going to talk about that one as well. The next slide, please. So, as I was mentioning, gastrodiplomacy is the intersection of food and foreign policy. It is this form of public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy focusing on using food as the medium to connect people. It's basically an understanding that you don't win hearts and minds through rational information. You do it through these emotional transrational connections, and that is most easily done through through music, food, art, dance, culture, but food especially. It understands that Marcel Proust knew you are most deeply hardwired to taste and smell. These are things that are most closely linked to memory and nostalgia. Gastrodiplomacy is a concerted effort of public and cultural diplomacy to share your culture through food. It's often involving multiple stakeholders, foreign ministries, ministries of trade, tourism, sometimes private sectors. You have hybrids. It's actually, interestingly, a form of public diplomacy, a form of policy that was invented by what's called middle powers, not the great powers, but countries that were trying to differentiate their nation brand, the understanding of that other publics had of their culture. It's a strategy to help differentiate different countries. It's and I'll share some of the examples of different countries that helped pioneer this tactic. So let's go on to the next one, and I'll talk about the next slide, please. So the very first country to conduct gastrodiplomacy was Thailand. Thailand set up what was called the Global Thai Program, where they helped create soft loan financing for restaurants. They basically decided the more Thai restaurants there were around the globe, the easier it would be to promote Thai culture, Thai cuisine, and ultimately boost the Thai nation brand and bring tourism back. So what they did is they helped create, as I mentioned, soft loan financing for Thai restaurants. They helped get, especially in places like New Zealand, they helped get authentic Thai chefs to get visas to work in Thai restaurants. They helped create access to Thai ingredients, authentic Thai ingredients, and they have certifications from the embassies for different Thai restaurants to make sure that what is being served is actually authentically Thai. They even came up with blueprints and templates for different Thai restaurants. And what that did is that took Thai food from being something very exotic to something very mainstream. There are more Thai restaurants in the U.S. than there are in some ways in Thai people. I mean, there's not a huge Thai community in the U.S., and yet there are everywhere you look, there are Thai restaurants, and that helped take Thai food from being something very exotic to something very mainstream. Next slide, please. So another country to conduct gastrodiplomacy was South Korea. South Korea was, prior to their they did so both cultural diplomacy and gastrodiplomacy combined. They helped promote K-pop, Korean music, and they also helped promote Korean cuisine. The problem had been that Korean brands had been basically somewhat cannibalized by Japan. Korean brands were thought to be Japanese. People didn't have a strong understanding of Korean culture, even though it was an economic powerhouse. So they helped promote Korean restaurants. They put funding into helping spread Korean cuisine. They promoted kimchi as being a healthy food, and they helped increase the ranking of Korean cuisine. Korean cuisine became the new Thai food. It became something, again, that was very exotic to suddenly being something that was very mainstream. Next slide, please. Taiwan is another country that has been doing gastrodiplomacy. I started writing about Taiwan's gastrodiplomacy when I was a visiting fellow at a think tank in Taiwan, looking at how Taiwan uses its public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy to get around its diplomatic difficulties. One of the ways they do that is through gastrodiplomacy, promoting different types of Taiwanese cuisine, and they did some fun cultural diplomacy events, such as they brought Taiwanese beef noodle soup to the Google headquarters, to the California State House, to the Sackler Museum in Washington, and they did a screening of Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, the famous Taiwanese director Ang Lee. And what they found is a significant portion of tourism to Taiwan, as well as Thailand and South Korea, was based on the cuisine. So next slide, please. We have another example, this one from the Muslim world, of Malaysian Kitchen for the World. This one was one of my favorite gastrodiplomacy programs, because Malaysia, they were very smart about it. They connected both the cuisine, the gastrodiplomacy, and the cultural diplomacy. So they had the program, which they were supporting through the Ministry of Trade, Ministry of External Affairs. And what they were doing is they were setting up night markets. Can I have the next slide, please? They set up night markets in New York, in the hip meatpacking district, in Santa Monica, in Los Angeles, and in London, in Trafalgar Square. They set up Malaysian night markets so that you could get a sense of both the cultural side of Malaysia and also taste the cuisine. And this was something they did. And also when the food truck craze was kicking off, they set up a Malaysian food truck. And one of the things they did, which was very smart, is they helped brand Malaysia as being a halal hub. They were doing a lot of outreach within the Muslim world, promoting Malaysia as a halal destination. So that's one of my favorite programs of gastrodiplomacy, especially the night markets, because it plays on multiple senses. You get a sense of Malaysian culture and cuisine all in one experience. There have been some other countries in the Muslim world that have done gastrodiplomacy more recently. Lebanon is a good example. Their foreign ministry and has been working with their diaspora ministry to connect the diaspora and the foreign office to do gastrodiplomacy. Turkey has been doing a bit more gastrodiplomacy. I was at the Gastro Economy Summit last year speaking about gastrodiplomacy. And so this is something that you're seeing become a more robust form of public and cultural diplomacy. Next slide, please. This is the U.S. State Department's Culinary Diplomatic Partnership. This was one that was a good bit of American cultural diplomacy. Everybody knows American cuisine. It's McDonald's and Starbucks and Pizza Hut. Well, this was really smart. This took, it showed different sides of American cuisine. It did regional cuisines, food from the Pacific Northwest or Cajun cuisine. They brought together a American chef corps from all of these famous chefs, probably about 80 chefs if I remember correctly, and sent them to be cultural ambassadors, culinary ambassadors. And so they would promote Cajun cuisine. They would promote soul food, showing different sides of American cuisine. And this was a way of connecting with all sorts of, iconoclastic ideas of what American cuisine constituted. It showed, the diaspora experience within the American culinary palate. So that was a program that lasted for a number of years. It was a very strong cultural diplomacy program. Next slide, please. This is one that is also more relevant to us on a local level: social gastronomy, also known as people-to-people gastrodiplomacy. I have a couple of pictures there. One of them, so this is how communities address social issues through cuisine. I've got a slide there, Vindaloo Against Violence. This was a program in Melbourne, Australia. There had been a spate of violence against some Indian students in Melbourne on some of the beaches. And so there was Vindaloo Against Violence campaign, had all sorts of people come together to different Indian restaurants and eat together and break bread together and show that the violence against the Indian community was unwelcome. Another example, another picture I have on there is from Emma's Torch. Emma's Torch is an organization in New York that helps empower immigrant and refugee chefs, helps them become entrepreneurs, helps them communicate their culture. And there's a lot of these breaking bread type programs, some of them supported by the International Rescue Committee, of using cuisine to help further the integration of immigrants and refugees in their home communities, helping create dialogue between migrants and the communities around them. And then there's also programs like the Refugee Food Festival. That's something that exists in Europe that's supported by the UNHCR to help bring refugee chefs into kitchens and help them communicate who they are through their cuisine. And the other picture I have on there is one called Conflict Kitchen, excuse me. Conflict Kitchen is a place in Pittsburgh that's a pop-up kitchen that would only serve food of countries that were in conflict with the US. So serving food from Iran, Afghanistan, Palestine, different places, as a way of Cuba, breaking down that cultural barrier that existed and helping to educate people, eaters, about what are some of the deeper issues that we face. So social gastronomy is a way in which we connect through some of the social issues and using food as a medium to do so. Next slide, please. So I spent 7 years working with the State Department running cultural diplomacy programs, working on gastrodiplomacy, cultural diplomacy. That was until the 2016 election. You might have noticed there was a little change in administration. There were really two things. I left my work, my cultural diplomacy programs with the State Department. I ended up in Morocco trying to take a sabbatical, figure out what my next steps would be. While I was living in Morocco, I was living in Chefchaouen, which is this beautiful city of blue. It was a refuge for the Jews who fled the conquest of Spain. They came to Morocco and they found haven there. They painted their houses blue. Over time, the whole city was painted blue. It's this beautiful city of blue in the mountains. I was taking some time there, trying to figure out which way the world was going. While I was there, two events really struck into my consciousness and brought me back here to the US to work on this communal public diplomacy. And I'll share a little bit of what I'm doing. The first was the marches in Charlottesville, seeing neo-Nazis marching in the streets saying, "Jew will not replace us," threatening my community. And the second thing was the Muslim ban. The idea that this country of immigrants was not welcoming to the Muslim community. I knew that I had to come back to the US and help fight for all communities, help fight for my community, the Jewish community, help fight for the Muslim community, help fight all of these communities that are dealing with bigotry. So I am now the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council. We do two things. Within the Jewish community, we work to make a more cohesive, collaborative voice for the Jewish community, especially in times of crisis. We have lots of issues of dealing with anti-Semitism. And then externally, we do advocacy, interfaith outreach, and community bridge building on behalf of the Jewish community. So what we do is we communicate issues that keep our community up at night, issues of anti-Semitism. And we help the Jewish community understand that keep the issues that keep other communities up at night, issues of Islamophobia for the Muslim community, issues of racism and bigotry for other communities. But this is really what brought me back to Phoenix, was to take my skill set in public diplomacy and help work here on the ground. Some of the issues we're involved in, we work on asylum issues of criminal justice reform. One of the issues that we had to deal with is issues of Islamophobia, specifically after the New Zealand mosque attacks. I went to Mufti Faya's mosque with Rabbi Bonnie Scharfman and Reverend Katie Sexton of the Arizona Faith Network. We were there during the Friday prayers. We helped bring the Jewish community out to the Islamic Center in the Northeast Valley to help bring the Jewish community to stand with the Muslim community against such hate and Islamophobia. This is something that we feel in our heart, that is important. If any community is threatened, we have to be by their side. And by the same token, just as your community is by our side. I mean, 6 weeks later, there was the shooting at the synagogue in Poway in California. One of the first people to reach out to me, probably the first person to reach out to me, was Azra Hussein. You have a phenomenal cultural ambassador and diplomat in Azra. I will speak as if she's not on this call, but she is right there. She is a tremendous public diplomat for the Muslim community. So here in Phoenix, we help use the resources and institutions, the soft power of the Jewish community to get the Jewish community more engaged in issues in civil society, speaking out about anti-Semitism, speaking out about Islamophobia. I mean, when there was that issue at the Scottsdale Community College, we put out a statement condemning the professor that was using Islamophobic materials because, look, the Muslim community has to fight Islamophobia, the Jewish community has to fight anti-Semitism, but the best voices to fight Islamophobia aren't always the Muslim community because you have to do that. But when it's the Jewish community standing by your side, that changes the calculations. When it's the Muslim community standing by our side, when we're dealing with anti-Semitism, that changes the calculations. That's us standing together, working to fight these issues, because the reality is, it's not the same coin, but there's this Venn diagram of people who hate the Jewish community and the Muslim community, and they share a lot of the same people. And so, this is what public diplomacy is all about. It's building bridges, it's communicating with the communities around you so that we can build this trust within civil society, that we can build these bridges to each other so that we can help, strengthen civil society, so that we can support each other as communities. That's what communal public diplomacy is all about. That's what Azra Hussein does every day. This is what I do every day. And this is, public diplomacy, it's not a panacea. It's not going, there's no silver bullets here, but it builds trust, and it's the building of the bridges. That's the start that we need. So on that, I'm going to open up for questions. I appreciate the time and the platform. I thank you. Shukran katia, shukriya. I could say it in a few other languages, but I will say thank you. Thank you, the Islamic Speakers Bureau, for having me, and shalom. So it looks like there's a question. Let's see what that question is. Is there any cultural diplomacy going on from the US right now? So the program, well, now being COVID, nothing's going on. Actually, I take that back. They're starting to do some virtual programming online. The programs that I worked on with the State Department, they still were going on after I left. American Music Abroad, Next Level, they were still continuing. I made the personal decision to work domestically, but these programs still existed and are still building bridges. And hopefully after COVID, there'll be some room to do these again. But yes, these programs still exist from the State Department. Any other questions? Oh, the language that gentleman was speaking was Bangla. That is the language of Bangladesh. And I have all sorts of hip hop in Shona, in Dabili, in Portuguese, in you name it, Swahili. There's a lot of hip hop worldwide. Any other questions?
That's all the questions.
Okay. Well, I thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for having me. And I hope that was educational. Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I hope that